But there's a question on screen there from Natalie Strecker, who's saying, do you think any of what we'll be talking about in terms of the challenges to create a better society, alternative society, as I think you and I would like to see, any of that be achieved through our current political system, or do we need a revolution? Basically, is essentially, I think, Natalie's question. What do you think to that? I mean, do we need a revolution?
Well, so I think that's the question that we all need to be asking ourselves about: what is the best way forward from this point? And I think it's probably going to require different groups of people all working in slightly in similar directions, but not necessarily with the same kind of exact sort of goals in mind. So the control of the Labour Party by right-wing politicians and by bureaucrats who share their views, making it a policy of the sort of the rich and the powerful, seems very strong at the moment, and they're going to get quite extreme measures to block grassroots activists or local parties from trying to bring about any change. They're shutting down discussion in one constituency after another. But to me, whilst this is unfortunately a very dangerous time in the sense of the power that these people wield, I think the fact that they are doing these things, to me, is a slight sign of desperation, in that I think it's becoming more and more clear to more and more people that the system is just not working, that it is completely broken. And so it's only when we have sort of mass awareness of these things that we're likely to bring about great change.
But can that change, though, be brought? I mean, the point that I think the question that Natalie is asking is, can that change then be brought about through the existing political structures, as I think many of us hoped would happen under Jeremy Corbyn, and we all saw what happened there, or does something else need to happen? Some form of revolution, some form of mass movement to force change, or not? Or do you think? Are you still hopeful that we can get some change through the normal channels?
I think hopeful might be the wrong word. But I don't think it's impossible that change could be achieved through the normal channels. But I think quite a lot of people who dropped out of the Labour Party when they became disillusioned with it in the last couple of years, I think perhaps there was always an opportunity. If you had this mass grassroots base connected to the Labour Party, I think there was a chance to bring about change by forcing change through the Labour Party, but it would have required people to be much more aggressive about the sorts of changes they were trying to bring about. I think having lost so many members, that becomes more difficult, but not impossible. So I can't give you a kind of yes or no answer to the question, because I don't know enough about the internal workings of the Labour Party to have any real idea of whether it can be salvaged or not. And somebody made an interesting point a few weeks ago, that in many of the countries where new left-wing parties have had some success recently, they are new parties. And so I think it is perfectly plausible that a new party can be formed from a new grassroots base and so on. But I often think in those countries where that's happened, things had already got so bad that people recognised there was no alternative. I think whilst people still believe there might be an alternative through the main Labour Party, then it becomes difficult to do the alternative. And one of the things that slightly disappointed me was talking to local members when Keir Starmer first kind of took the leadership over. Too many people were saying, well, I think he could be completely different. I think we have to give him a chance. And so that most people just did not recognise that he is the heart of the British establishment. He is not there to rescue the Labour Party. He is there to make sure that it's either a completely right-wing party, or he's there to make sure it's useless in opposition. And either of those would be sort of equally bad. So I think people do need to slightly wake up to, ordinary people need to become more savvy about being critical about what's really going on. And I think there is still this element missing in order to pursue either route. You know, people are not yet sufficiently critical of the existing Labour Party. Not enough people are sufficiently critical of the existing Labour Party and recognise the scale of change required. And I think an awakening needs to happen. And it's always hard to know how bad life in any society has to get before people will wake up. But it may well be that various philosophers have pointed out over the years how systems appear to be incredibly stable right up to the moment they collapse. And so the Berlin Wall is the most famous example of that. And so it may well be that something slightly out of left field, something unpredictable, let's say like the coronavirus, which caused immense hardship for a great many people, will be something that might trigger people to be kind of more questioning and so on. Now, I'm not sure that the coronavirus is it, because I think we've probably ridden through the worst of it. And to me, there wasn't enough sort of awakening. So you never know what might bring about change. So I think on that front, we just hope that more and more people will start to wake up. But the first part of that is always to build these kind of networks that expand outwards, where people change the conversation. You know, everyone listening here tonight can start having different conversations with everyone they know, with their friends, with their families, with their colleagues and acquaintances, which doesn't just buy into the mainstream kind of media nonsense that takes the existing system as reasonable, but actually start to be much, much more critical. So we have to find ways to get everybody to be more questioning and more critical and more thinking about what sort of society we ultimately want to live in.
So do you think that's the catalyst then? It's we all need to be that catalyst. Is that what you're saying? Or do you think that an event needs to happen that then sparks?
So I don't know. I think it's the nature of these things. I would love to be able to give really simple answers and say, well, I'm sure what will definitely happen is this. But history is slightly less predictable than that, unfortunately. So I can't say for sure whether there will be a specific event or whether there will just be a gradual awakening across, you know, tens of millions of people or not. We just have to wait and see. But I think, oddly enough, that we're not kind of alone in this situation as a nation. It's actually something similar is happening in lots and lots of other countries. So the mainstream news often focuses on America, and we see all sorts of things going on in America where ordinary people are recognizing, you know, what an unfair society they live in. And if you look at, say, healthcare, in many ways, their system is already much more unfair than our system. And the other day, I was looking at a documentary which is talking about very similar points to the ones I was making about the housing situation, where more and more cities in London ordinary people are being priced out. Even people with what would be considered decent engineering jobs and so on just cannot afford to buy the properties that are being built in their cities.
What should we be demanding then, Rod, in that regard? I mean, should we be banning foreign billionaires from purchasing property in this country? Because I mean, like, that clearly is an issue. But then we've got our own homegrown billionaires who are making a killing out of the property market. What's the solution there, do you think, to that we should be demanding?
I think the housing thing is sort of multi-layered. So firstly, people have to understand that there are downsides to the presence of very rich people. And that will start a debate going about what policies we change. Then I would start saying, over time, we need to find ways to massively decrease not only the wealth, but also the power of very rich people. We need to accept that they didn't really earn that wealth in the first place. And even if people's ideas on how to decrease their wealth are limited or kind of narrowed by their range of thinking, people might start to say, but quite obviously, if they're making donations to politicians, if they're funding politicians, if they're lobbying politicians, we can see that the political system will only represent them. It won't represent the masses. And so people might be able to say, let's change the system of party funding. Let's change the system of lobbying. So I always think there's a sort of there are various inconsistencies in government policies. So a few years ago, the government talked a lot about saying to NGOs and campaign organisations, if you receive government funding, you can't get engaged in politics. You know, if you're Greenpeace, you do what Greenpeace does, but you don't do politics. If you're Friends of the Earth, you do what Friends of the Earth does, but you don't do politics. And so, and that was a condition of receiving money from the government. But at the same time, what I talked about last week was the government giving masses and masses of money to big companies. And of course, big companies are having conversations, quiet, private conversations with governments all the time. And so the government has this complete double standard, this hypocrisy, where the representatives of ordinary people and the representatives of civil society are not allowed to do certain things, whereas big companies get away with doing whatever they want to do. And the government is actively helping them to do that. So if more people become aware of all the different aspects of the system, that it's completely rigged in favor of big companies and the rich and the powerful and so on, then people can start saying, well, we do actively need to have a campaign organization that's about saying no more corporate lobbying. And I personally would love to see some mainstream politician come along and say, listen, we shouldn't have the richest 1% involved in politics at all. And now you might say, well, surely that's not democracy. You can't exclude a group of people. But bizarrely, the 1% get all the attention, and many other groups of people are actually excluded, even if it's not written down in the rules. And the 1% can actually look after themselves. You know, it doesn't matter if you tax them at a very high rate, and so they'll still be phenomenally wealthy. They'll still be successful. They'll still be doing their thing. They don't need a political system to serve them, but unfortunately it does. So I think if people started talking about the various aspects of a system, let's say you've got the political system and you've got the policing system, and if politics and the police were both about protecting the 99% from the 1%, then that's an entirely different conversation than what we have now, which is mostly about protecting the 1% from the 99%. Obviously in terms of politics, but to some extent even in terms of policing and so on, that the crimes of the powerful, which again is a topic we might talk about in some detail in a future week, the police don't actually pursue them, and where the police might occasionally try to pursue them. So if British Aerospace pays $7 billion to the Saudis as a bribe to buy British weapons, the Serious Fraud Office try to investigate, and the government actually steps in and blocks a police investigation into. Well,
we shouldn't be doing business with the Saudis in any event. I mean, they're a rogue state, and we should be banning any sales of military hardware to them, as we should be doing with Israel as well. But never mind the corruption that goes along with that. But that's a whole question about the military industrial complex and the influence that they obviously have. But I noticed there's a question there on the screen from Amelia Washbourne saying about the utilities fat cats. How about the fat cats from the utilities? Profit made, our prices go up, services don't change. And I mean, I did some work when I was still an MP and got the House Commons Library just to look at the profits and corporation tax and dividends that have been paid by the utilities, and it was quite shocking actually. The very minimal amounts paid in corporation tax, huge profits, but absolutely colossal dividends. And if those institutions were in the public sector, of course, then there would be no need for dividends, and that money could be used to improve the system. I mean, water was the very worst in terms of the huge dividends that were being paid out, and we know that there are massive leaks and water bills extremely expensive. I mean, I think you could have the best of all worlds. You could, from those figures that the House Commons Library did anyway, it seems you could actually reduce water bills and improve services at the same time. But I don't know, what's your thoughts about the utilities and what's happened there and the way they've made lots of people very rich?
So I didn't mean to talk over you. So the utilities are a great example, firstly, of what I was talking about sort of last week, where the system is set up. So if you have big, powerful private companies that dominate a sector, they can extract vast amounts of wealth out of it. And then the payments to shareholders from the utilities is the kind of the step that we were talking about today, where individuals who own a lot of these shares and many of the shares of the biggest companies are owned by the 1%, then they receive all of these dividends and the increases in the value of the shares. So that's the asset price inflation that I was talking about. And they are getting these immense free lunches. And my own view is similar to, there's an American economist, if people have never heard of him, he's very well worth reading. I consider him to be the best economist in the world. His name is Michael Hudson. And his opinion is that anything that you might consider like a state utility or a natural monopoly, so that would be water, gas, electricity, but it would also include the banking sector, and it might even include the development of medicines, so the pharmaceutical sector. All of them should be owned and controlled by the state to provide what they provide at the lowest possible cost to everybody. And he makes an interesting, he has an interesting discussion about the history of kind of economic ideas. And he says that 130 years ago or earlier, up until about 130 years ago, every economist, whether it was Karl Marx or Adam Smith, the whole spectrum, they all recognized that you must not put these giant businesses into private hands, because private owners will just find ways to abuse their power to extract more and more wealth from each of those utilities. You have to keep them all in public hands to provide whatever they're providing. So it's the water, it's the electricity, it's the financial services, if it's the banking sector, at the lowest possible cost. So there's no excess profits to be made, there's no giant payouts to shareholders, and the whole economy then runs fantastically well. And the same would apply to the health service. So we have a national health service that we can rightly be proud of, that the government at the moment is actively demolishing in order to gradually privatize it a bit at a time. And that should also be a utility that is available very, very cheaply to everybody. Once you privatize it, the private owners will find ever more complex ways to extract more and more wealth from those systems, and the cost to everybody else goes up.
As we're seeing, Rod, with the care service in this country, because that, and we had a mixed economy, didn't we? And we probably still have to some extent, but it's diminished in terms of the public sector that provides social care for people, and whether it be domiciliary care in people's homes or whether it be people living in nursing homes, residential care homes, predominantly in the private sector now, and people paying huge sums of money, several £1,000s a week, and people who perhaps bought their own council house or maybe struggled to bought their own house are finding, working class people that at the other end of their life, that asset is having to be used to pay for their care. And there's a question there, just on your point about the NHS that you were talking there from Diane I can't read that. Is it Iserilis? Is it? As I pronounce that? Iserilis. Sorry, Diana, if you've pronounced your name incorrectly. But Diana is asking, could the imminent collapse and full privatisation of the National Health Service be a catalyst for a big change, or at least contribute to it, do you think? And we were talking about what the catalyst might be. Do you think that's a possibility? Because the NHS is a loved institution, isn't it, in this country?
Yes. So I do think that people are sort of switching on to the fact that although the government have been doing it kind of stealthily over many years and in little bits and pieces here, that suddenly there's a rapid change going on with GP surgeries and so on, that more people are starting to become aware that, as you say, this prized institution is going to be handed over to private companies. And it's very much an attempt at what you might call the Americanization of the healthcare system. And every analysis by anybody who's serious at studying the healthcare system says you absolutely do not want to Americanize your healthcare system. And there was a very famous quote many years ago. There was a secret recording of a comment by an advisor to President Nixon in America. And they were talking about whether to create a national health service for America. And the advisor said, the great thing about a private healthcare system is that all the incentives point in the wrong direction. Now, that just means that everybody who would be involved in a private healthcare system has opportunities to take more money. So the doctors can take more money, the insurance companies can take more money, the hospitals can take more money, the drug companies can take more money, and the price just goes through the roof to ordinary users. And the whole system can never, ever work properly like a properly funded NHS can. So if we're lucky, then something like the NHS could be the sort of trigger that wakes people up and gets people out on the streets campaigning. But
yeah, this is where I think the the Labour Party in Parliament has been sadly lacking, really, because there's been no real proper leadership there. I mean, I think this should have been front and centre and sort of really been highlighting it. There's been some effort to do that, but nowhere near enough. And they should. I mean, this is one of the things with Jeremy, of course, which we were hoping, in terms of creating a mass movement, a social movement, that they could have taken that struggle from Parliament onto the streets and back again. And I think that would have been, sort of squaring that circle would have sort of been a very elegant way, I think, of trying to raise some of these issues. But just on the point about insurance, though, Rod, what's your thoughts about insurance in general? We take it. I mean, we think it's, well, I think most of us probably in this country would see an American-style insurance system for, healthcare as anathema. But we just take for granted that we have insurance for our cars. It's private sector that do that, and they make huge profits from it. Private sector that we insure our homes with, and so on and so forth. And it's often something I've often thought about is why are we farming this out to the private sector? Why doesn't the state just come in and we say we pay because, for example, young people who are starting out, buying their first car, they've just passed the test and they get a car. They're being charged, £3,000 or £4,000 or more for their insurance, huge sums of money, which is very difficult for a young person to, particularly these days, many of them on very low incomes. Why is it, do you think, in the hands of the private sector? And should it be? And is that something that the state should be providing as well?
Well, I think it's really great that you've asked that question, because I've actually never heard anyone ask that question before, but it's actually a really important question. And so it's a great thing to kind of get the audience to say, okay, yeah, I could have thought of that question. I need to question what underpins what's going on, not take anything for granted. And I haven't researched the car insurance or the home insurance sector in enough detail to see if there are any major downsides to the state being the insurer for homes and cars. I'm sure it would work just fine, and I'm sure it would end up being much cheaper for everybody. With any system, you realise that there might be sort of little loopholes that you'd have to look at very closely, some sort of insurance fraud here and there. But that's the same with any system. And I actually think you're right, that insurance is the sort of thing that if you can remove the profit layer, then you could make the cost much cheaper than it is. And in fact, one of the things that I was researching in writing many of the things that I write about was Warren Buffett's investment strategies. So some people will be aware that Warren Buffett is one of the most famous, most successful investors in the world. He seems to be very good at picking certain types of investments that seem to work very well in the long term. But I also discovered that he uses the wealth in the sort of pool of investments as an insurance fund. And so it is there taking in insurance premiums as extra income. And the amount you will pay out, let's say with car insurance or household insurance, will be considerably less than the amount you'll take in. So he's making that extra layer of profit. So it's quite a profitable industry. And I think it would be perfectly fine to remove the profit layer from the insurance system and not have it run as a private system. And just one final point, if I've got time, some people who've ever studied history will be aware that 100 years ago, people used to have private insurance with fire companies to put out your fire. And the reason everywhere in the world eventually ended up with a state-run fire service is because everybody realized how inefficient the system was. You had multiple fire companies. If you didn't have insurance with the right company, your fire wouldn't be put out. And so that's where the term fire sale comes from. Houses would burn down and you'd have to sell off your things to get any income. So it didn't work. It was a disaster. So we have examples historically of where private insurance doesn't actually work very well. And it may well be the case that we can improve the car and the home insurance system by having a nationally run system.